She danced crazily in the market, unaware the Duke was watching. When their eyes met, Eliza Stanfield's world stopped turning. 3 years of secretly admiring Benedict Winthrop, Duke of Fenwick, from ballroom corners had just collided with her most improper moment. What a way for the universe to announce that hiding was no longer an option. Hello my lovely listeners. If you're enjoying this historic romantic tale, I'd be so grateful for a like or a subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories of love, longing, and history. And if you can, kindly tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It always brings a smile to my face knowing where in the world my stories get to. Let's continue with our story. Lady Eliza Stanfield had made her decision over cold toast and her father's colder disapproval approximately 3 hours before she found herself dancing like a woman possessed in Covent Garden marketplace. The decision was this: she would rather die unmarried and honest than live as the emotionless porcelain doll her father demanded she become. "You smiled too broadly at the Cavendish ball," Lord Geoffrey Stanfield said that morning, not looking up from his newspaper. His voice had the warmth of January frost. "Lady Esther Thompson remarked that you laughed quite loudly during cards." "Loudly, Eliza, as if you found something genuinely amusing." Eliza had stared at her father across the breakfast table, watching him dissect her failures with the same careful attention he gave to his business accounts. Too much animation here, excessive enthusiasm there, visible emotion absolutely everywhere. The list went on until Eliza felt like she was being presented with evidence of crimes she didn't know she'd committed. "I apologize, father," she'd said, because that was what proper daughters did. They apologized for feeling things. Apologies are insufficient. Her father finally looked at her, and Eliza saw something in his eyes that made her blood run cold. Not anger exactly, but something worse. Disappointment mixed with determination. "I've been patient with you, Eliza. 3 seasons of allowing you to find your own match. That patience has expired. You will learn to control yourself, or I will arrange a marriage that requires no feelings whatsoever. Geoffrey Wallace has expressed interest. A match could be finalized within the month." Geoffrey Wallace. Cold, controlling Geoffrey Wallace, who spoke to women the way one might address poorly trained dogs. Eliza's hands had tightened around her teacup until she thought it might shatter. "Yes, father," she'd whispered, because what else could she say? But as she'd climbed the stairs to her bedchamber afterward, something inside her had cracked wide open. Not broken exactly, but opened, like a door she'd been holding shut finally giving way. She'd reached her room, closed the door, and leaned against it, breathing hard. "Miss?" Winifred, her lady's maid, had looked up from making the bed with concern. "Are you quite well?" "No," Eliza had said honestly. "I'm absolutely not well, Winifred. I'm suffocating, and I'm tired, and I cannot breathe in this house for one more moment without screaming." Winifred had studied her for a long moment, then moved to the wardrobe. "Then perhaps Miss should go somewhere she can breathe. Somewhere no one from society would think to look. I believe I saw a perfectly unremarkable day dress that would suit such an occasion." 20 minutes later, Eliza had slipped out of the townhouse in a simple dress of pale grey, a bonnet that hid most of her distinctive auburn hair, and a shawl borrowed from the cook. She looked like a respectable shop girl or perhaps a governess on her day off. She looked, blessedly, like no one anyone would recognize. The marketplace had called to her like a song. She could hear it from 2 streets away, the chaos of vendors calling their wares, children laughing, the sound of actual human joy unfiltered by propriety. By the time Eliza reached Covent Garden, she was nearly running, drawn toward life the way a drowning person reaches for air. The marketplace was glorious chaos. Flower sellers competed with fishmongers for attention. A woman sold ribbons in every color imaginable. Children darted between stalls while their mothers bargained over vegetables. And everywhere, people felt things openly. They laughed when something was funny. They argued when they disagreed. They existed in their bodies without apology. Eliza stood at the edge of it all, breathing it in like medicine. This was what she'd been missing. This honest, messy, beautiful reality. Then the music started. A small group of musicians had gathered near the flower stalls. A fiddle, a flute, and someone with a drum. They were playing something fast and joyful, something that made feet want to move. Around them, common people had begun to dance, not the careful, measured steps of a ballroom waltz, but real dancing. Spinning and laughing and moving with complete abandon. Eliza watched them, transfixed. A woman in a worn blue dress spun past, her skirts flying, her face lit with pure joy. A man caught his dancing partner around the waist and lifted her, both of them laughing. No one was counting steps or worrying about form. They were just moving because the music told them to move. The fiddle grew louder, faster. Eliza's foot began tapping without her permission. Her body swayed slightly, remembering what it felt like to move freely. Before she knew she'd decided, before she could talk herself out of it, she'd stepped forward into the dancing crowd. A market woman in an apron grabbed her hand, laughing. "Come on then, love, don't be shy." And Eliza danced. She danced the way she'd wanted to dance at every ball she'd ever attended. She spun and laughed and let her body move however it wanted to move. Her bonnet slipped back, releasing her hair. Her shawl fell from her shoulders. She didn't care. For the first time in months, maybe years, she felt completely, gloriously alive. The music swelled and Eliza threw her head back, laughing at the sky. She spun faster, her skirts swirling around her legs. She was free. For 3 perfect minutes, she was utterly, spectacularly free. Then she spun around one more time, still laughing, and her eyes landed on a figure standing motionless at the edge of the crowd. Everything stopped. The music was still playing. People were still dancing around her. But Eliza had frozen completely, staring at the tall man in aristocratic dress who stood watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Benedict Winthrop. The Duke of Fenwick. The man she'd admired from afar for 3 entire seasons. The man who'd danced with every accomplished lady in London but had never once looked in her direction. The most eligible bachelor in England was standing not 10 feet away, and he just watched her dance like an absolute madwoman in a public marketplace. This was fine. This was completely fine. Just a duke watching her dance like someone who'd escaped from an asylum. Totally recoverable. Perhaps if she stood very still, he'd mistake her for a statue and wander away. Horror flooded through her, followed immediately by something that felt dangerously like defiant laughter. Of course. Of course this was how the universe worked. The one moment she'd allowed herself complete freedom, and Benedict Winthrop had been there to witness it. Their eyes locked across the dancing crowd. Eliza watched him watch her, waiting for disgust to cross his handsome features. Waiting for him to turn away in horror at her spectacular display of impropriety. Instead, slowly, Benedict Winthrop smiled. Not mockingly. And not with the cruel amusement of someone who'd just witnessed a scandal. But with something that looked remarkably like wonder, as if he'd just seen something beautiful and couldn't quite believe his luck. Then he started walking toward her. Eliza's mind raced through her options. She could run, but that would be obvious and undignified. She could faint, but that felt too dramatic even for this situation. She could pretend she didn't know him, but his face had been burned into her memory since the first ball she'd ever attended. So she stood there, breathing hard from the dancing, her hair falling down around her shoulders, her respectable disguise completely ruined, and waited for Benedict Winthrop to reach her. He stopped directly in front of her. Up close, he was even more handsome than she'd remembered. Dark hair slightly mussed by the wind. grey eyes that seemed to see right through her. A serious face that was currently doing something it rarely did in public, smiling with genuine warmth. "My lady," he said, his deep voice cutting through the marketplace noise. "That was quite the most extraordinary thing I've seen in years." Eliza opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. Several responses fought for supremacy in her mind, none of them appropriate. Finally, she managed, "Your Grace. I can explain." "Can you?" His smile widened slightly. "Because I'm rather hoping you can't. I'm hoping it was pure impulse, completely unplanned. Otherwise, it wouldn't be nearly as remarkable." Eliza blinked at him, confused. "You're not disgusted?" "Disgusted?" Benedict looked genuinely surprised. "Why on earth would I be disgusted? You just danced with more joy and freedom than I've seen in 3 years of London balls. You looked gloriously, perfectly alive." He paused, his grey eyes searching her face. "How did you do it?" "Do what?" Eliza asked faintly. "Dance like no one was watching when clearly everyone was watching." Eliza had not slept. Not one single minute of the entire night following the marketplace incident, as she'd begun calling it in her mind. She'd lain in her bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every mortifying second. The dancing. The spinning. The absolute abandonment of every rule she'd ever been taught. And then, worst of all, Benedict Winthrop appearing like some sort of aristocratic ghost to witness her complete and utter failure at being a proper lady. Except he hadn't looked horrified. That was the part that made no sense whatsoever. He'd looked pleased. Delighted even. And he'd asked her that impossible question about dancing like no one was watching, as if he genuinely wanted to understand rather than condemn. They talked for perhaps 10 minutes in the marketplace before Eliza's nerve had failed her completely and she'd made some excuse about needing to return home. Benedict had bowed formally, his eyes still holding that strange warmth, and said he hoped they might speak again soon. Then he'd let her flee like the coward she was. Now it was the next afternoon, and Eliza sat in the drawing room with her mother, pretending to do needlework while her mind spun in circles. Her father was mercifully absent, conducting business somewhere in the city. If he'd been home, he would have immediately noticed her distraction and demanded an explanation she absolutely could not give. "You seem troubled, darling," her mother said gently, looking up from her own embroidery. Lady Harriet Stanfield was a kind woman, softer than her husband, though she'd learned long ago not to contradict him openly. "Did you sleep poorly?" "Something like that," Eliza murmured, stabbing her needle through the fabric with more force than necessary. The butler appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral in the way that meant something interesting was about to happen. "My lady, the Duke of Fenwick has called. He wishes to know if Lady Eliza is receiving visitors." Eliza's needle slipped, stabbing her finger. She made a small sound of pain and surprise, pressing her thumb to the wound. "The Duke of Fenwick?" Her mother's voice had gone up slightly, the way it did when she was trying very hard to remain composed. "Here? To see Eliza specifically?" "So he indicated, my lady." Eliza's mother looked at her with wide eyes, clearly trying to communicate something urgent without speaking. Probably something along the lines of "How did this happen, and please don't ruin this opportunity. Show him in, please. Eliza, sit up straight. And for heaven's sake, stop bleeding on the embroidery." Benedict entered the drawing room like he owned it, which in a sense he did. Dukes owned everything simply by virtue of being dukes. He wore a dark coat that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, his cravat tied with casual elegance. He looked every inch the proper aristocrat, except for his eyes, which found Eliza immediately and held the same warmth they'd held in the marketplace. "Lady Stanfield," he said, bowing to her mother. "Thank you for receiving me on such short notice. Then he turned to Eliza and bowed again, deeper this time. "Lady Eliza, I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Your Grace," Eliza's mother said quickly, before Eliza could form words. "We're delighted. Absolutely delighted. Would you care for tea?" "That would be lovely, thank you." The next 15 minutes passed in a blur of polite conversation that Eliza barely participated in. Her mother asked about Benedict's family, his estates, the weather, every safe topic imaginable. Benedict answered graciously while somehow managing to look at Eliza more than was strictly proper. She could feel her cheeks heating under his attention. Finally, after what felt like 17 years, Benedict set down his teacup and turned to Lady Stanfield with a smile. "I wonder if I might impose upon your hospitality further. The gardens visible from your windows are quite lovely. Might I request a brief walk with Lady Eliza? Chaperoned, of course." Eliza's mother looked like Christmas had arrived early. "Of course, Your Grace. What a splendid idea. The gardens are at their finest this time of year. Eliza, fetch your shawl." 5 minutes later, Eliza found herself walking through her family's London garden with the Duke of Fenwick at her side and her mother trailing behind at a distance that was technically appropriate for propriety but far enough away that their conversation would remain private. The garden was small by estate standards but beautifully maintained, with roses beginning to bloom along the walls and a small fountain providing pleasant background noise. Benedict said nothing for several moments, simply walking beside her in silence. Eliza's heart hammered so loudly she was certain he could hear it. Finally, she couldn't bear it anymore. "Your Grace, about yesterday in the marketplace, I must apologize for—" "Please don't," Benedict interrupted gently. "Don't apologize. That's not why I came." "Then why did you come?" The question emerged more boldly than Eliza had intended. Benedict stopped walking and turned to face her fully. Behind them, her mother had paused to examine a rose bush with exaggerated interest. They were as alone as two unmarried people could be in 1843 London. "I came because I couldn't stop thinking about you," Benedict said simply. "From the moment I left the marketplace yesterday, you've occupied my every thought. I lay awake most of the night trying to understand what I witnessed." Eliza's breath caught. "I'm not sure I understand." "Do you know what it's like," Benedict asked, his grey eyes intense, "to attend 3 full social seasons and never once see a person be genuinely themselves? To watch hundreds of accomplished, beautiful women perform perfect propriety without ever glimpsing who they actually are beneath it?" "I imagine it's what most gentlemen prefer," Eliza said carefully. "Perfect ladies who never disturb the peace with actual emotions." Benedict laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "That's what we're supposed to prefer, certainly. That's what I've been told to want since I inherited the title at 21. Marry someone appropriate, someone cold and composed who will manage my households without ever requiring actual human connection. Someone who will produce heirs and host dinner parties and never, ever be inconvenient by having feelings." He ran a hand through his hair, disrupting its careful arrangement. Eliza realized with surprise that he was nervous. The Duke of Fenwick, eligible bachelor of England, was nervous talking to her. "I came to the marketplace yesterday for the same reason you did," Benedict continued. "To escape. To breathe. To exist for 1 hour without someone performing for me or at me. And then I saw you dancing, and it was like watching someone remember they were alive." He took a step closer, close enough that Eliza could see the gold flecks in his grey eyes. "You weren't performing. You weren't trying to impress anyone or secure anyone's approval. You were just beautifully, completely yourself." "My father would say that's precisely the problem," Eliza whispered. "Then your father is wrong," Benedict said firmly. "Though I suspect you already know that, or you wouldn't have been in the marketplace to begin with." Eliza found herself smiling despite her nervousness. "Are you always this direct, Your Grace?" "Never," he admitted. "I'm supposed to be diplomatic and measured and perfectly proper at all times. But apparently watching you dance has broken something in me. Or perhaps fixed something. I'm not entirely sure which." "I've watched you for 3 years," Eliza heard herself say, then immediately wanted to sink into the ground. "That is, I've seen you at balls and gatherings. From across rooms. You never seem to notice." "The Pembridge Ball," Benedict said immediately. "Your first season. You wore a white dress with blue trim. You were arguing with Charles Thompson about something political, completely forgetting to pretend you didn't have opinions. I stood across the ballroom thinking I'd never seen anyone more alive, more real. And then your mother pulled you aside and you spent the rest of the evening looking like you'd been scolded." Eliza stared at him. "You remember that?" "I've remembered you through 3 seasons of perfect, boring women," Benedict said. "I watched you dim yourself year after year, hiding that passionate spirit I glimpsed at the Pembridge Ball. I told myself it was for the best, that I should marry someone appropriate rather than someone who made me feel things. But then I saw you yesterday, dancing like you'd finally escaped to prison, and I realized I'd been lying to myself for 3 years. Your Grace, I don't understand what you're saying." Benedict took a breath, then another. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter but somehow more intense. "I'm saying I've been half in love with you since the Pembridge Ball. I'm saying that watching you dance yesterday made me realize that marrying someone cold and appropriate would be the greatest mistake of my life. I'm saying that I want to know the real you, the passionate woman who dances in marketplaces and argues about politics and refuses to be a porcelain doll." The garden spun slightly. Eliza gripped her shawl tighter to steady herself. "This doesn't make sense. Dukes don't fall for improper women who can't control themselves." "Then perhaps I'm not a very good duke," Benedict said with a slight smile. "Or perhaps I'm finally becoming a good man instead of just a good title." He paused, his expression turning serious again. "Lady Eliza, I would like your permission to court you properly. To call on you formally, to escort you to appropriate events, to give both of us time to determine if what I felt yesterday was real or merely novelty." "My father will never approve," Eliza said automatically. "He wants me cold and controlled. You saw the opposite yesterday." "Then I'll have to convince your father that passion is not the same as lacking control," Benedict replied. "That a woman with genuine feeling makes a far better duchess than a beautiful statue." "You truly mean this," Eliza said slowly, still not quite believing. "You're not testing me or playing some game." "I swear on my title, on my estates, on everything I possess, that I mean every word," Benedict said. "I know it's sudden. I know we barely know each other beyond what we've observed across ballrooms. But I also know that I've spent 3 years slowly dying of boredom, and 5 minutes watching you dance brought me back to life." He extended his hand toward her, palm up, an invitation. "Will you give me the chance to know you? The real you, not the version your father demands." Eliza looked at his hand, then at his face. He was serious. Impossibly, incredibly serious. The Duke of Fenwick wanted to court her, not despite yesterday's disaster but because of it. She placed her hand in his. "Yes, Your Grace. I'll give you that chance. Though I should warn you that the real me is considerably more trouble than the version I show in ballrooms." Benedict's smile was brilliant. "Lady Eliza, I'm counting on it." Benedict had called on Eliza 3 times in the 5 days following his garden confession, each visit perfectly proper and absolutely revolutionary. Her father had been present for 2 of them, watching with cold calculation as the Duke of Fenwick paid careful attention to his unsuitable daughter. Lord Stanfield hadn't forbidden the courtship, which Eliza suspected had more to do with Benedict's title than any softening of opinion. One didn't casually dismiss a duke, even if one disapproved of his choice. On the 6th day, Benedict sent a note requesting the honor of taking Eliza driving in Hyde Park at 4 o'clock. The hour was significant. 4 o'clock on a pleasant afternoon meant the fashionable promenade, when all of London society gathered to see and be seen. It was where courtships were made publicly official, where eligible gentlemen showed off their chosen ladies, where reputations were built or destroyed depending on who acknowledged whom. Eliza's mother had nearly wept with joy. Her father had said nothing at all, which somehow felt more ominous. Now Eliza sat in her room while Winifred fussed over her appearance, trying to make her look properly Duchess-worthy. The pale yellow walking dress was lovely but simple, nothing that screamed desperate attempt at grandeur. Her hair had been arranged in a style that was fashionable without being fussy. She looked, Eliza thought critically, like herself but tidier. "You look beautiful, miss," Winifred said warmly, stepping back to assess her work. "The Duke won't be able to take his eyes off you." "That's precisely what I'm afraid of," Eliza muttered, along with approximately 300 other pairs of eyes. When Benedict arrived in his curricle, Eliza understood immediately that he'd meant what he said about making his intentions clear. The vehicle was clearly designed for attention, glossy black with the ducal crest displayed prominently on the sides. The matched pair of greys pulling it probably cost more than most families earned in 5 years. Everything about the setup announced wealth, status, and deliberate choice. Benedict himself looked devastatingly handsome in a dark blue coat and buff-colored breeches, his cravat tied with casual perfection. He helped Eliza into the curricle with exquisite care, his hand lingering on hers a moment longer than strictly necessary. His grey eyes held a question she answered with a small nod. She was ready for this, or at least as ready as anyone could be for public spectacle. "You look beautiful," Benedict said quietly as he took the reins. "Though I feel I should warn you that we're about to become the subject of intense scrutiny and considerable gossip." "I suspected as much when I saw your vehicle," Eliza replied. "It's not exactly subtle." "Subtlety would defeat the purpose," Benedict said with a slight smile. "I want everyone to know I'm courting you. No ambiguity, no room for speculation about my intentions. Just plain, obvious truth." They entered Hyde Park and immediately every head within sight turned in their direction. Eliza felt the weight of hundreds of eyes landing on her like physical pressure. She forced herself to sit straight, to keep her expression pleasant but not frozen, to remember how to breathe. The fashionable crowd had gathered in force. Elegant carriages lined the paths, their occupants arranged like displays in shop windows. Ladies in their finest walking dresses promenaded on gentlemen's arms. Horses pranced under riders who were more interested in being seen than actually riding. It was London society's daily theatre, and Eliza had just been thrust onto centre stage. "Is that Lady Eliza Stanfield with the Duke of Fenwick?" someone whispered loudly enough to be heard. "Surely not. He's been expected to declare for Lady Harriet Cavendish. Or Miss Daphne Cromwell. Everyone said it would be Miss Cromwell." Benedict kept his attention on the horses, seemingly unbothered by the whispers that followed them like a wake. Eliza tried to match his composure, though her hands wanted to fidget in her lap. She settled for gripping her reticule perhaps more tightly than necessary. Lady Peaton's barouche appeared ahead of them, the elderly widow known for her sharp tongue and sharper observations. She'd been one of the voices declaring Eliza's animation at the Cavendish ball unseemly. Now she stared at them with such obvious shock that she nearly drove directly into a tree. Her driver had to yank the horses aside at the last moment, causing a small commotion that drew even more attention their way. "Oh dear," Benedict said mildly. "I do hope Lady Peaton's horses are well." That was quite the dramatic swerve. Despite her nervousness, Eliza felt a laugh bubbling up. She pressed her lips together, trying to contain it, then remembered Benedict's words in the theater. "You're allowed to laugh." So she did, quietly but genuinely, and felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "There you are," Benedict murmured, "just for her. I was worried I'd lost you to propriety." They continued their circuit, acknowledging acquaintances with polite nods. Miss Catherine Thornbury sat frozen in her carriage, staring at them with an expression somewhere between disbelief and calculation. Lady Arabella Cromwell, Daphne's older sister, looked like she'd just witnessed something personally offensive. The younger ladies, the ones still hoping to catch ducal attention, watched with barely concealed dismay. But it was Lady Harriet Cavendish who brought the afternoon to its crisis point. She appeared on horseback, which was already unusual for a lady at the fashionable hour. Harriet Cavendish was everything Eliza wasn't, tall and blonde and possessed of the kind of cold beauty that looked carved from marble. She wore a riding habit of deep blue that probably cost more than Eliza's entire wardrobe, and she positioned her horse directly in their path with the skill of someone who'd planned the maneuver carefully. Benedict had no choice but to stop. "Your Grace," Harriet said, her voice carrying that particular tone of aristocratic sweetness that meant trouble. "What a pleasant surprise. I had not expected to see you here this afternoon. I was under the impression we'd made plans to ride together. Did I misremember?" It was beautifully done, Eliza had to admit. The suggestion of prior commitment, the implication that Benedict had forgotten or chosen to ignore an arrangement with a more suitable lady. The word misremember with just enough emphasis to suggest that no misunderstanding had occurred at all. Benedict's expression remained perfectly pleasant. "I believe you may have misunderstood a casual remark for a firm commitment, Lady Harriet. I made no promises regarding this afternoon." "How interesting that our recollections differ," Harriet continued, her blue eyes flickering to Eliza with barely concealed disdain. "And Lady Eliza, how unexpected to see you in such distinguished company. I don't believe we've been properly introduced, though of course I've observed you at various events. You've been rather quiet during the past seasons, haven't you? I'd almost forgotten you were participating in the social rounds at all." The implication was crystal clear. Forgettable. Unremarkable. Beneath notice. Eliza felt heat rising in her cheeks, anger mixing with embarrassment. This was what she'd feared, this public dismissal by women who represented everything society valued. Women who were cold and perfect and completely sure of their superiority. Eliza could have stayed quiet. Could have let the moment pass with a polite murmur. That's what the old Eliza, the properly controlled Eliza, would have done. But something about sitting beside Benedict, about remembering dancing in the marketplace, about 5 days of conversations where her thoughts actually mattered, made staying silent impossible. "Quiet, yes," Eliza agreed pleasantly. "I found that silence often reveals far more than constant conversation, Lady Harriet. One notices the most fascinating things when one simply observes rather than performing for attention." Harriet's perfect smile froze slightly. "I'm not certain I take your meaning." "No," Eliza continued, her tone remaining sweet while her words carried blades. "How strange. I'm simply saying that some people confuse visibility with value, attention with genuine interest. That desperation, no matter how beautifully packaged in expensive riding habits, remains desperation underneath." Several nearby riders had stopped to listen, clearly sensing drama. Eliza saw shock register on multiple faces, though whether shock at her rudeness or her audacity, she couldn't tell. Benedict made a sound beside her that might have been a suppressed laugh. Harriet's face had gone pink with fury, though she was trying valiantly to maintain her composure. "How extraordinarily rude, Lady Eliza. Your Grace, surely you don't condone such appalling behavior from your companions." "I find Lady Eliza's honesty refreshing," Benedict said clearly, his voice carrying to the gathered audience. "I've spent 3 seasons surrounded by performances and careful calculations. It's a relief to court someone who says what she actually thinks." He looked directly at Harriet, his expression still pleasant but his eyes cold. "And to be perfectly clear, Lady Harriet, I made no commitment to you about this afternoon or any other. I'm courting Lady Eliza with the full intention of offering for her hand should she find me acceptable. I wanted everyone to understand that clearly, so there would be no further misunderstandings about my intentions or availability." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. Benedict had just publicly declared his courtship and his intentions in front of witnesses who would spread the news across London before sunset. There would be no backing away from this, no graceful retreat. He'd committed himself completely and publicly. Harriet stared at him for a long moment, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "I see. How very clear you've made yourself, Your Grace. I wish you joy of your choice." She wheeled her horse around and rode away at a pace that was just barely acceptable for the park. The gathered spectators began murmuring immediately, heads drawing together in excited conversation. Benedict guided the curricle forward, continuing their circuit as if nothing unusual had happened. Eliza sat beside him, her heart racing, uncertain whether to laugh or cry or possibly both. She'd just been spectacularly rude to one of London's most influential young ladies. She'd defended herself publicly. She'd watched Benedict declare his intentions in front of half of society. "Are you well?" Benedict asked quietly. "I'm not certain," Eliza admitted. "I just said terrible things to Lady Harriet." "You said honest things," Benedict corrected. "There's a difference. Though I'll admit, watching you defend yourself with words as sharp as blades was rather magnificent." "My father is going to hear about this within the hour." "Yes, he will," Benedict agreed. "Along with the fact that a duke has publicly declared his intention to court and potentially marry you. That should complicate his objections somewhat." They completed their circuit in silence, both of them aware of the stares and whispers following them like a tide. By the time Benedict returned Eliza to her home, the gossip would have already reached Mayfair drawing rooms across London. The word would spread that the Duke of Fenwick had chosen Eliza Stanfield over every appropriate, accomplished lady available. That he'd defended her publicly against Lady Harriet's subtle attack. That he'd made his intentions unmistakably clear. 17 minutes, Eliza later learned. That's how long it took for the news to reach every significant household in fashionable London. 17 minutes for her life to change completely and irrevocably, for better or worse. The spectacle was complete, and there was no going back now. The invitation arrived 2 days after the Hyde Park spectacle, delivered on heavy cream paper with the Fenwick seal pressed into dark blue wax. Benedict's aunt, the Dowager Duchess Fanny Winthrop, requested the pleasure of Lady Eliza Stanfield's company for tea at the Fenwick townhouse in Grosvenor Square. The note was gracious and warm, nothing like the cold formality Eliza had expected from ducal correspondence. Her mother had nearly combusted with nervous excitement. Meeting the aunt was significant, a clear step towards serious courtship. It meant Benedict's family was prepared to accept her, or at least assess whether she was acceptable. Eliza tried not to think about all the ways she could fail such an assessment. The Fenwick townhouse was elegant without being ostentatious, a 4-story building with perfectly maintained gardens and an air of quiet wealth that didn't need to announce itself. A footman appeared immediately as Benedict helped Eliza from the carriage, and she was shown into an entrance hall that somehow managed to feel lived in rather than like a museum. Books sat on side tables. Fresh flowers filled vases. A half-finished embroidery project lay on a chair near the window, as if someone had just set it down moments before. "Eliza," a warm voice called from the drawing-room doorway. "Oh, don't look so terrified, child. I don't bite, regardless of what London gossip might suggest." Lady Fanny Winthrop was perhaps 55, with greying hair arranged fashionably and kind eyes that reminded Eliza distinctly of Benedict's. She wore a day dress of deep green that was elegant without being fussy, and her expression held barely contained delight rather than the cold assessment Eliza had feared. "Aunt Fanny," Benedict said with obvious affection, "may I present Lady Eliza Stanfield? Eliza, my aunt, the Dowager Duchess of Fenwick." "Lady Eliza," Fanny said, clasping both of Eliza's hands warmly. "I'm absolutely delighted to meet you. Benedict has spoken of little else for the past week, which has been wonderfully refreshing. Usually he only discusses crop rotation and parliamentary reform." "I discuss other things," Benedict protested mildly. "No, darling, you really don't," his aunt said cheerfully, pulling Eliza toward the drawing room. "Come, sit. Tell me everything. How did you manage to capture my nephew's notoriously elusive heart? He's been impervious to every eligible lady in England for 3 full seasons." Eliza found herself settled on a comfortable sofa while Fanny poured tea with practiced ease. Benedict took a chair nearby, watching the interaction with an expression of poorly concealed satisfaction, as if he'd known exactly how this would go. "I wore a terrible disguise and danced wildly in a public marketplace," Eliza said honestly, deciding that if Benedict valued authenticity, his aunt might appreciate the same. It was the least Duchess-worthy behavior imaginable. Fanny laughed delightedly. "Oh, that's perfect. Absolutely perfect. So you accidentally impressed a duke by being completely yourself rather than trying to impress him at all. The irony is delicious." "I'm not certain impressed is the right word," Eliza said. "Shocked might be more accurate." "Captivated," Benedict corrected quietly. "The word you're looking for is captivated." His aunt studied Eliza with keen interest, the kind of assessment that saw far more than surface appearances. "Do you know what it's like for Benedict, being a duke? People have treated him as a title rather than a person since he inherited at 21. Every conversation is calculated. Every interaction has an agenda. Women perform for him, men defer to him, and no one simply talks to him like he's human." "I hadn't thought of it that way," Eliza admitted. "I always assumed dukes had everything they wanted." "Everything except genuine human connection," Fanny said. "That's the price of the coronet. My nephew has spent 7 years being extraordinarily lonely while surrounded by people. He's been proposed to dozens of times by women who couldn't tell you his favorite book or whether he prefers morning or evening. They know his income and his properties and his political influence, but they don't know him." Benedict had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "Aunt Fanny, you're making me sound pathetic." "You are pathetic, darling," his aunt said fondly. "Or you were, until Lady Eliza danced her way into your field of vision and reminded you what it felt like to be seen as a person rather than a position." She turned back to Eliza. "That's why authenticity is so intoxicating to someone who's always treated as extraordinary. You didn't see a duke. You just saw a man standing at the edge of a marketplace, and you were too busy being yourself to perform for his benefit." "I was mortified when I realized who he was," Eliza confessed. "I'm certain you were," Fanny agreed. "But you'd already shown him the real you, which is precisely what made it remarkable. You couldn't take it back or pretend it never happened. He'd witnessed your genuine passionate self, unfiltered and unperformed." She smiled warmly. And apparently it was exactly what he'd been waiting 3 years to find. The conversation flowed easily from there, 2 hours passing like minutes. They discussed books, Fanny delighted to discover that Eliza read widely and had opinions on everything from Byron to political philosophy. They argued amiably about whether the railway expansion would fundamentally alter English society, Eliza insisting it already was, while Fanny maintained the aristocracy would resist change as they always did. Benedict contributed occasionally but seemed content mostly to watch the two women in his life connect. "You read John Stuart Mill?" Fanny asked at one point, her eyebrows rising. "My dear girl, you're either brilliantly educated or dangerously radical. Possibly both." "My father would say dangerously radical," Eliza said. "He prefers I read nothing more challenging than household management guides." "Your father sounds tedious," Fanny said bluntly. "No offense intended." "None taken. He is tedious, among other things." When it was finally time to leave, Fanny embraced Eliza warmly at the door. "You're exactly what Benedict needs," she said quietly. "Someone who sees him rather than his title. Someone alive and passionate rather than cold and calculating. Don't let London society convince you otherwise. They'll try, because authentic feeling makes them uncomfortable, but they are wrong." Benedict walked Eliza to the carriage, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back. "She likes you," he said unnecessarily. "She's been telling me for 3 years to find someone with substance rather than just beauty and accomplishment." "She's wonderful," Eliza said honestly. "I was terrified she'd be cold and judgmental." "She's the least cold person I know," Benedict replied. "Which is probably why she recognized the same quality in you immediately." He helped her into the carriage, then held her hand a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for being yourself with her. For not trying to perform or pretend." "I'm not certain I remember how to perform anymore," Eliza admitted. "You seem to have broken that ability in me." Benedict's smile was brilliant. "Good. That was rather the point." The invitation to Lord and Lady Salisbury's dinner party arrived with the weight of inevitability. It was one thing to court publicly in Hyde Park or visit Benedict's aunt in private. It was quite another to face London society in the intimate setting of a formal dinner, where every fork placement mattered and conversation was as carefully choreographed as a ballet. Eliza understood immediately that this was a test, though whether she was meant to pass or fail remained unclear. Her mother had insisted on the burgundy silk, the finest evening gown Eliza owned. It was beautiful by any reasonable standard, the color rich against her auburn hair, the cut flattering without being immodest. Martha had arranged her hair elegantly, weaving in a simple strand of garnets that had belonged to her grandmother. Eliza looked, she thought with satisfaction, exactly like herself, dressed well. That satisfaction lasted approximately 30 seconds after entering the Salisbury drawing room. Every other lady present wore gowns that probably cost enough to feed a family for a year. Lady Arabella Cromwell was draped in emeralds the size of quail eggs, the stones catching candlelight like green fire. Miss Catherine Thornbury wore pearls that must have taken 3 generations to accumulate, layer upon layer of lustrous white that made Eliza's simple garnets look like market trinkets. Even Lady Harriet Cavendish, still presumably nursing her wounded pride from Hyde Park, wore diamonds that sparkled with cold brilliance. Eliza felt the comparison like a physical weight. She'd known intellectually that she came from a respectable but unremarkable family, that her father's modest fortune couldn't compete with true aristocratic wealth. But knowing something intellectually and standing in a room full of evidence were entirely different experiences. Benedict found her immediately, his eyes warming when he saw her. He crossed the room with purpose, ignoring several attempts to intercept him, and bowed over her hand. "You look beautiful," he said quietly, his voice holding nothing but sincerity. "I look modest," Eliza corrected, unable to keep the self-consciousness from her tone. "There's a difference." "Yes, there is," Benedict agreed. "They look expensive. You look real. I know which I prefer." But dinner arrangements separated them ruthlessly. Lord Salisbury had organized his seating with typical aristocratic precision, couples carefully divided, conversations orchestrated to facilitate appropriate social interaction. Eliza found herself placed between Lord Arthur Ashford, an elderly gentleman she vaguely recognized from Hyde Park, and Mr. Peter Thornbury, Catherine's older brother and a man whose reputation for cutting remarks preceded him. Benedict was seated across the table and 3 places down, close enough to see but too far for private conversation. She watched him charm Lady Penton on his left while deflecting obvious flirtation from a young lady on his right whose name Eliza couldn't remember. He caught her eye twice and smiled in ways that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else, which helped slightly. "Lady Eliza," Lord Ashford said warmly as the first course was served. "I must confess to considerable curiosity. The Duke of Fenwick has been London's most eligible bachelor for 3 seasons. How did you capture his notoriously elusive heart?" The question was delicately phrased, genuinely interested rather than accusatory. Lord Ashford had kind eyes and the sort of weathered face that suggested he'd lived long enough to care less about propriety than honesty. "I wore a terrible disguise and danced like a madwoman in a public marketplace," Eliza said honestly. Apparently that was more interesting than 3 years of perfectly accomplished ladies agreeing with everything he said. Lord Ashford laughed, a genuine surprised sound that drew attention from nearby diners. "I like you, Lady Eliza. You remind me of my late wife. She never bothered with polite lies either. Said what she thought and let others sort out their feelings about it." "Some would say that's a character flaw," Eliza replied. "Some would be wrong," Lord Ashford said firmly. "Honesty is only a flaw to people who profit from deception." On her other side, Mr. Peter Thornbury made a small sound that might have been amusement or disdain. How refreshing to hear such radical philosophy at a formal dinner. One does wonder if Lady Eliza realizes that a duchess requires more than charming honesty. The position demands considerable grace, tact, and the ability to navigate delicate social situations without causing offense. It was beautifully delivered, the words themselves almost complimentary while the tone suggested she possessed none of those qualities. Eliza felt her cheeks heat but forced herself to remain composed. "I imagine," she said carefully, "that any worthwhile position benefits from genuine character rather than simply performing prescribed roles. Though perhaps that's too radical a philosophy for formal dinners as well." Thornbury smiled thinly. "Indeed. One might also argue that sudden elevations in social status based on temporary fascination rather than proven compatibility often end poorly for all involved. But I suppose that's merely my observation from watching society for considerably longer than you've participated in it." The remainder of the dinner passed in similar fashion. Lord Ashford asked genuine questions about her interests and opinions, seeming delighted by her honest responses. Thornbury made pointed comments about unexpected attachments and the difference between novelty and lasting regard, each remark carefully phrased to sound like friendly concern while cutting deeply. Across the table, Eliza saw Benedict's jaw tighten each time Thornbury spoke, but the formality of the dinner prevented him from intervening. When the ladies finally withdrew to the drawing room while the gentlemen remained with their port and cigars, Eliza felt like she'd survived a battle only to face another immediately. Lady Salisbury arranged herself prominently on the central sofa and gestured for everyone to sit. Eliza chose a chair slightly apart from the main group, hoping desperately to avoid direct confrontation. She should have known better. "Lady Eliza," Lady Arabella Cromwell said with saccharine sweetness, her emerald earrings catching the lamplight. "We're all simply dying to understand. What is it like courting the Duke? He's been so resistant to attachment these past years. It must be quite overwhelming for someone of your background." The question sounded innocent on the surface. The undertone suggested a dozen insults Eliza was clearly meant to hear. Someone of your background. Someone unprepared for such elevated attention. Someone who didn't belong. "His Grace has been kind enough to seek my company," Eliza said carefully, trying to navigate the conversational minefield. "I find him to be intelligent, thoughtful, and considerably more interesting than most gentlemen of my acquaintance." "How diplomatic," Miss Catherine Thornbury murmured, sitting beside her sister-in-law with matching expressions of cold amusement. Though one must wonder how long such careful diplomacy can last. "The Duke has always preferred ladies of exceptional beauty and accomplishment. One imagines the novelty of something different might fade rather quickly." Several other ladies had gone silent, watching the exchange with the fascinated attention of spectators at a public execution. Eliza could feel her heart racing, anger and embarrassment warring in her chest. This was the moment she'd feared. The direct attack she'd known was coming eventually. She could stay silent and accept the insult. She could make some polite deflection and change the subject. That's what proper ladies did when faced with social cruelty. They absorbed it gracefully and moved on. But Eliza was so very tired of being what proper ladies were supposed to be. "Miss Thornbury," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the fury building inside her, "I appreciate your concern for the Duke's romantic welfare, though I cannot help but notice you seem remarkably invested in his choices for someone he's never courted himself." Catherine's smile froze slightly. "I merely observe that His Grace has always demonstrated particular preferences. Ladies of refinement, education, and appropriate background. One naturally questions whether such a dramatic departure from established preference indicates genuine feeling or merely temporary fascination with something unusual." "Then perhaps the Duke's established preferences were never his true preferences at all," Eliza replied, her voice growing stronger. "Perhaps he spent 3 years surrounded by ladies who performed refinement and education while never actually engaging with him as a person rather than a title to acquire." She stood, unable to remain seated for this. Several ladies gasped at the breach of etiquette, but Eliza was past caring about proper behavior. "You speak of compatibility as if it means matching expectations rather than matching souls. As if the Duke should choose someone who looks appropriate in his drawing rooms rather than someone who makes him feel alive. But I've watched His Grace at balls and gatherings for 3 years, and I've seen how utterly bored he looks when surrounded by ladies who agree with everything he says and laugh at jokes that aren't funny and perform constant deference to his title." "How dare you?" Catherine began, her face flushing with anger. "I dare because it's true," Eliza interrupted, propriety completely abandoned now. "The Duke has explained his preferences to me quite clearly. He spent 3 years dying slowly of boredom surrounded by accomplished, beautiful ladies who saw him as a prize to win rather than a person to know. Ladies who would rather agree with everything he says than risk genuine conversation. Ladies who perform dignity and refinement so perfectly that there's nothing real underneath to engage with." She met Catherine's furious gaze directly. "If that's what you consider exceptional accomplishment, Miss Thornbury, then I'm quite glad to be lacking in it. Because the Duke has made clear he prefers a wife who feels things and argues and challenges him to someone who performs perfection while being utterly empty inside." The drawing room had gone completely silent. Lady Arabella stared at her with an expression that might have been shock or grudging admiration. Lady Salisbury's face was carefully neutral, though her eyes held calculation. Several younger ladies looked between Eliza and Catherine with fascinated horror, clearly uncertain whether to be scandalized or impressed. Catherine stood abruptly, her face now fully flushed with humiliation and rage. "I think I shall join the gentlemen. This conversation has become tiresome and frankly beneath my dignity to continue." She swept from the room with her head high, though the effect was somewhat ruined by the speed of her exit. After she left, the remaining ladies continued staring at Eliza with varying expressions. Some looked disapproving. Others looked thoughtful. A few of the younger ones looked like they wanted to applaud but didn't quite dare. Lady Arabella finally broke the silence. "Well," she said slowly, "that was extraordinarily interesting." The gentleman rejoined them shortly after, and Benedict immediately gravitated to Eliza's side. He took one look at her face and frowned with concern. "What happened?" "Miss Thornbury happened," Eliza said quietly. "I may have been somewhat sharp with her." "Good," Benedict said with satisfaction. "She's been making pointed comments about my surprising choice all evening. I'm glad you defended yourself." But as they left the party later, Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She'd been publicly, spectacularly rude to a woman of higher social standing. She'd called out half of London's eligible ladies for performing rather than feeling. She'd claimed to understand the Duke's preferences better than women who'd known him far longer. The gossip from this dinner would spread just as fast as the Hyde Park incident, but this time Eliza wasn't certain the story would favor her. She'd been honest, yes, but she'd also been harsh. And society rarely forgave harsh honesty, no matter how true it might be. Benedict insisted on escorting Eliza home in his carriage rather than letting her leave with her parents, a breach of strict propriety that her mother surprisingly didn't protest. Perhaps Lady Stanfield sensed something significant was about to happen, or perhaps she simply recognized that fighting a duke's determination was an exercise in futility. Either way, Eliza found herself alone with Benedict in the elegant confines of his carriage, the London streets passing in darkness outside. For several moments, neither spoke. Eliza stared at her hands in her lap, replaying every cutting word she'd said to Catherine Thornbury, every moment of lost composure, every spectacular failure at being the gracious lady a duke's future wife should be. The anger that had sustained her through the confrontation had drained away, leaving only exhaustion and worry. "You're thinking too loudly," Benedict said gently, breaking the silence. "I can practically hear your thoughts from here, and none of them are kind to yourself." "I was appallingly rude to Miss Thornbury," Eliza said quietly. "To several ladies, actually. I called them empty and performing and said terrible things about how they treat you." "You said honest things," Benedict corrected. "Though I'll admit, watching you verbally eviscerate someone who'd been subtly attacking you all evening was rather magnificent. My aunt will be delighted when she hears about it." Eliza looked up at him, surprised to find him smiling. "You're not disappointed? I just proved I lacked the grace and tact required of a duchess. Your friend Mr. Thornbury was right about that at dinner." Benedict's smile faded, replaced by something more serious. He shifted closer on the carriage seat, close enough that Eliza could see the gold flecks in his gray eyes even in the dim light. "Eliza, I need you to understand something. The next weeks are going to be difficult. People will say cruel things about you, about us, about my judgment in choosing you. They'll question your suitability, your background, your behavior tonight. They'll try to undermine your confidence and make you doubt yourself and convince you that you're not good enough for this position." "Perhaps they are right," Eliza whispered. "They are not," Benedict said firmly. His hand found hers in the darkness, warm and solid. "Listen to me carefully, because I'm only going to say this once. I am not courting you despite who you are. I'm courting you because of exactly who you are. Not despite your passion but because of it. Not despite your honesty but because of it. Not despite your refusal to perform and pretend but because you refuse to destroy yourself for others' comfort." He moved even closer, his other hand coming up to cup her face gently, tilting it so she had to meet his eyes. "You are not a novelty that will wear off. You are not a mistake I'll regret. You are the woman I've been half in love with since I watched you argue about poetry at the Pembridge Ball 3 years ago. The woman I fell completely in love with when I saw you dancing in that marketplace like you'd finally remembered you were alive." Eliza's breath caught. "Benedict, we've known each other properly for less than 2 weeks." "I've known you for 3 years," he corrected. "I've watched you from across ballrooms, seen you dim yourself season after season, noticed every time you caught yourself being too animated and forced yourself back into composure. I've been a coward about it, I'll admit that freely. I told myself I should marry someone appropriate and suitable, someone who would cause no scandal and require no defense. But watching you dance broke something in me, or fixed something. I realized I'd rather face society's judgment with you than face a lifetime of loneliness with someone appropriate." He released her face and reached into his coat pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. Eliza's heart stopped completely. This was happening. This was actually happening. "This is highly irregular," Benedict admitted, opening the box to reveal a ring that caught even the carriage's dim light. A sapphire surrounded by small diamonds, elegant and beautiful and perfect. "We should wait. I should court you properly for months, ask your father's permission formally through appropriate channels, propose in some romantic setting planned weeks in advance. But I've already waited 3 years, Eliza, and I don't want to wait any longer." He took her left hand in his, the ring poised but not yet offered. "Lady Eliza Stanfield, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? Of being the Duchess who argues and feels and dances and refuses to pretend? Of building a life with me based on genuine feeling rather than appropriate performance?" Eliza stared at the ring, then at Benedict's face, hopeful and nervous and utterly sincere. Every rational thought told her this was too fast, too soon, too risky. They barely knew each other outside of public settings and chaperoned visits. Society would call her a fortune hunter or worse. Her father might actually disown her for being so spectacularly unsuitable. But Benedict was looking at her like she was precious. Like she mattered. Like her passionate, argumentative, inappropriate self was exactly what he wanted rather than something to tolerate or fix. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Yes, Benedict, I'll marry you. Though I should warn you that I'm still terrible at being a proper lady and I'm likely to embarrass you regularly." His smile was brilliant, transforming his usually serious face into something almost boyish with joy. He slipped the ring onto her finger where it fit perfectly, as if it had been made specifically for her hand. Then he was kissing her knuckles, her wrist, her palm, propriety completely abandoned in the privacy of the carriage. "We'll announce it properly tomorrow," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "At the Pembridge Ball. The same place where I first saw the real you 3 years ago. I want everyone who doubted us to understand that this is real and permanent and not subject to their approval." "Tomorrow," Eliza repeated, looking at the ring on her finger, this physical proof that the impossible had somehow become real. "Everyone will know." "Everyone will know," Benedict confirmed. He pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her in a way that would scandalize every chaperone in London. "Let them talk. Let them gossip and judge and speculate. By tomorrow night, you'll be my publicly acknowledged fiancé, and they'll have to accept that the Duke of Fenwick chose passion over propriety, feeling over performance, and you over every appropriate lady in England." Eliza leaned against him, breathing in his familiar scent, feeling the solid reality of his embrace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new gossip, new judgment. But tonight, in this carriage rolling through London's dark streets, she allowed herself to simply feel joy. Pure, uncomplicated, impossible joy. She was going to marry the man she'd loved from afar for 3 years. And he loved her not despite her flaws but because of them, because she danced wildly in a marketplace and refused to be less than herself. If that wasn't proof that the universe occasionally got things spectacularly right, Eliza didn't know what was. Eliza's parents were waiting in the entrance hall when she arrived home, clearly having heard the carriage pull up some time ago and wondering why their daughter hadn't immediately come inside. Her mother's expression shifted from concern to confusion to wide-eyed shock as Eliza held up her left hand, the sapphire catching the lamplight. Lady Stanfield actually screamed, a small delighted sound that would have mortified her under any other circumstances. She rushed forward, grabbing Eliza's hand to examine the ring more closely, tears already forming in her eyes. "Oh, my darling girl. Oh, Eliza. You're going to be a duchess. The Duchess of Fenwick. I can hardly believe it." "I'm going to be Benedict's wife," Eliza corrected gently. "The title is secondary." But her mother wasn't listening, already spinning into plans about wedding preparations and guest lists and whether they should host the ceremony in London or at one of Benedict's country estates. Her excitement was genuine and touching, even if her focus seemed entirely on the wrong aspects of the engagement. Lord Stanfield had remained silent throughout his wife's outburst, studying Eliza with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not the cold disapproval she'd expected, but something more complex. Calculation mixed with concern, perhaps even a hint of grudging respect. "Eliza," he said finally, his voice measured. "A word in my study, please." Her mother looked like she wanted to protest but seemed to recognize this was inevitable. Eliza followed her father down the hall, her heart beating faster with each step. This was the confrontation she'd been dreading, the moment when her father would list every reason why she was unsuitable, why Benedict would regret this choice, why she'd embarrassed the family with her behavior. Her father closed the study door and gestured for her to sit. He remained standing, leaning against his desk in the way he did when considering complex problems. The silence stretched long enough that Eliza's nerves began to fray. "Did you know the Duke was visiting today when you chose to wear that simple dress to the marketplace 2 weeks ago?" he asked finally. "No, father. I had no idea he would be there. I went to escape, not to attract attention." "And yet you managed to attract the attention of England's most eligible bachelor by being spectacularly inappropriate." Her father's expression remained unreadable. "I've spent 3 years trying to mold you into a proper lady. 3 years of corrections and criticisms and demands that you control yourself. And you secure a duke by doing the exact opposite of everything I taught you." Eliza couldn't tell if he was angry or admiring or simply confused by the irony. "I'm sorry if I've disappointed you, father. I know I'm not the daughter you wanted." "You're not," he agreed, and the words stung even though Eliza had expected them. But then his expression softened slightly, something she'd rarely seen. "But perhaps I was wrong about what you needed to be. The Duke has called on you 6 times in 2 weeks. He's defended you publicly against London's most influential ladies. He's proposed after a courtship that society will call scandalously brief. Men don't do that for women they're uncertain about, Eliza. They do it for women they're desperate not to lose." He moved to sit behind his desk, suddenly looking older than his years. "I wanted you controlled and composed because I thought that was what society valued. I thought passion and feeling were liabilities that would prevent you from making an advantageous match. It appears I was wrong. Or at least wrong about what the right match would value." "Are you giving your approval?" Eliza asked carefully, afraid to hope. "The Duke asked my permission earlier this evening, before dinner," her father admitted. "He was quite clear about his intentions and his reasoning. He said you were the most genuine person he'd encountered in 3 years of social seasons. That your authenticity was worth more than all the practiced propriety in London." He paused. "I gave my consent, though I'll admit I had doubts. I still have doubts. But watching him defend you tonight, watching how he looks at you, I think perhaps he sees something I've been too rigid to recognize." Eliza felt tears pricking at her eyes. It wasn't the warm acceptance she'd dreamed of, but it was more than she'd expected. Her father acknowledging he might have been wrong felt like a gift she hadn't known to hope for. "Thank you, father," she said quietly. "Don't thank me yet," he replied with a hint of dry humor. "Your mother is already planning a wedding that will likely bankrupt us all. I believe she's considering inviting half of England." Later that night, Eliza lay in bed staring at the ring on her finger, watching how it caught the moonlight streaming through her window. 3 years of believing she was too much and not enough simultaneously. 3 years of watching Benedict from afar and assuming he'd never notice someone like her. 3 years of carefully managed loneliness and resignation. And now this. An engagement ring on her finger. A proposal from the man she'd loved in secret. A future that seemed impossible but was somehow, miraculously real. She thought about the simple dress she'd worn to the marketplace, the decision to seek temporary freedom without caring who might see. That choice, that one moment of choosing authenticity over appearance, had changed everything. If she'd stayed home that day, stayed properly composed and controlled, she might have secured a different kind of match eventually. Someone appropriate but lifeless, like Geoffrey Wallace. Someone who wanted a porcelain doll instead of a person. Instead, she danced wildly in public and caught the attention of a duke who'd been drowning in propriety, desperate for something real. Tomorrow they would announce their engagement at the Pembridge ball, and society would have their opinions. But tonight, Eliza allowed herself pure gratitude. For the marketplace. For the dancing. For the terrible disguise that had freed her to be herself. For Benedict's grey eyes watching her spin with wonder instead of disgust. Sometimes, it seemed, the universe rewarded spectacular failures of propriety with spectacular happiness. Eliza smiled at the ceiling, her ring catching light, and let herself believe in impossible things. The Pembridge ballroom fell silent the moment Benedict raised his glass and called for attention. Eliza stood beside him, her hand trembling slightly in his, watching hundreds of faces turn toward them with varying expressions of curiosity, suspicion, and barely concealed hostility. This was it. The moment that would make their engagement undeniably public and irreversible. "My lords, ladies, and gentlemen," Benedict said, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed room. "I have the great honor of announcing my engagement to Lady Eliza Stanfield, the most remarkable woman in England." The silence stretched for perhaps 3 seconds, which felt like 3 hours. Then the room erupted. Some applauded politely. Others whispered furiously to their neighbors. Lady Harriet Cavendish looked like she'd swallowed glass. Miss Daphne Cromwell stared with frozen shock. But it was Lady Victoria Sterling's expression that Eliza would remember most vividly, a mixture of disbelief and fury that suggested she'd been personally betrayed by Benedict's choice. Lady Fanny Winthrop started a louder round of applause from her position near the front, and gradually others joined in, whether from genuine pleasure or social obligation remained unclear. Lord Ashford raised his glass with a warm smile. A few younger ladies looked thoughtful, as if witnessing something that challenged their assumptions about courtship and choice. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations that ranged from sincere to coldly perfunctory. Some people embraced the engagement with genuine warmth. Others offered congratulations that sounded like condolences. The Ton had made their positions clear. This was a scandal they would watch closely, waiting to see if the Duke's unconventional choice would prove foolish or inspired. Eliza didn't care. She had Benedict beside her, his hand warm on hers, his presence steady against society's judgment. That was enough. The wedding itself, 3 months later, scandalized London by being smaller and more intimate than anyone expected for a ducal marriage. Benedict had insisted on meaning over spectacle, inviting only people who genuinely mattered rather than everyone who expected invitations based on rank. They married in the small chapel on one of Benedict's country estates, surrounded by family and a carefully chosen group of friends. Lady Fanny wept throughout the ceremony, though whether from joy or relief that her nephew had finally found happiness remained unclear. Eliza's mother cried as well, overwhelmed by seeing her daughter become a duchess. Even Eliza's father seemed moved, though he maintained his composure until his speech at the wedding breakfast. "I spent 3 years trying to make my daughter into something she wasn't," Lord Stanfield said, holding his glass with surprising steadiness. "I thought passion was a liability and control was necessary. I was wrong. The Duke of Fenwick saw what I was too rigid to recognize, that authenticity matters more than performance, that genuine feeling is worth more than practiced propriety." He paused, looking at Eliza with something approaching apology. "To my daughter, who was brave enough to be herself even when everyone told her not to be. And to the Duke, who was wise enough to choose love over expectation." It wasn't the agricultural tangent everyone had been quietly expecting, but it was heartfelt in a way Eliza had never heard from her father before. She cried into Benedict's shoulder afterward, overwhelmed by the unexpected gift of her father's acceptance. The first months of marriage brought their own challenges. Eliza had to learn the intricate management of multiple households, navigate relationships with staff who weren't certain about their unconventional new duchess, and attend social events where half of society still watched her critically, waiting for her to prove herself unsuitable. Benedict supported her through every stumble, defending her choices publicly and encouraging her privately to trust her instincts. Some members of society gradually warmed to her, charmed by her honesty and genuine interest in causes beyond social climbing. Others remained coldly disapproving, particularly the ladies who'd expected Benedict to choose one of them. Eliza learned to distinguish between people worth winning over and people who would never accept her regardless of how perfectly she performed. When Eliza discovered she was carrying their first child 4 months into their marriage, Benedict made a decision that scandalized London all over again. He announced they would be leaving for his Yorkshire estate immediately and would not return for the remainder of the season. The Ton was horrified. Dukes didn't abandon London during the social season. They didn't prioritize their wives over political obligations and social expectations. They certainly didn't choose domestic happiness over maintaining their presence in society. "Let them be horrified," Benedict said when Eliza expressed concern about the gossip. "I spent 3 years dying slowly in London ballrooms before I found you. I'm not going to lose you or our child because society expects me to attend tedious dinner parties and pretend I care about their opinions." So they moved to Yorkshire, to the sprawling estate with views of the moors and space to breathe without constant scrutiny. They hosted small gatherings of genuine friends rather than obligatory social events. They walked the grounds together in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing. They built a life based on authentic connection rather than appropriate performance. Society watched and gossiped and speculated about whether the Duke's unconventional marriage would last. Some predicted it would end in scandal or regret. Others quietly envied what Benedict and Eliza had built, even if they'd never admit it publicly. But in Yorkshire, far from London's judgment, the Duke and Duchess of Fenwick discovered something more valuable than social approval. They found partnership, genuine joy, and the profound peace of being completely known and loved anyway. The marketplace dancing that had started everything had led them here, to a life neither had imagined but both had desperately needed. The Yorkshire estate nursery was filled with afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows that overlooked the moors. Eliza sat in the rocking chair near the window, watching her husband hold their 3-month-old son with a mixture of devotion and absolute terror that made her heart swell with affection. "He's so small," Benedict said for perhaps the 100th time since Thomas's birth. "Are babies supposed to be this small? Are we certain he's healthy? Should we call the physician again?" "We called the physician yesterday," Eliza reminded him gently. "And the day before that. And twice last week. He confirmed Thomas is perfectly healthy, just normally small because he's a baby." "He could have grown since yesterday," Benedict argued, carefully adjusting his grip on their son, who seemed utterly unbothered by his father's anxiety. Babies grow, don't they? Perhaps we should measure him daily to ensure proper development." Eliza laughed, the sound warm and genuine in the quiet nursery. A year ago, she'd been standing in a marketplace dancing wildly, certain she'd never marry, never be chosen, never have this impossible life. Now she was the Duchess of Fenwick, mother to a healthy son, married to a man who somehow became more devoted with each passing day. The year since their engagement had passed in a whirlwind of change. The wedding had been beautiful despite society's mixed reactions. The first months of marriage had been an adjustment, learning to navigate ducal responsibilities while society watched critically. The move to Yorkshire when her pregnancy was confirmed had scandalized London but given them the peace they'd both desperately needed. Through it all, Benedict had remained steady, defending her choices publicly, supporting her privately, proving daily that his choice of her over more appropriate ladies had been based on genuine love rather than temporary fascination. A knock at the nursery door preceded Lady Fanny's entrance, followed by Eliza's parents who were visiting for the week. The Dowager Duchess immediately moved to admire her grandnephew, cooing over him with the sort of unrestrained affection she'd never shown in London society. "Oh, he's perfect," Fanny declared. "Absolutely perfect. Though Benedict, darling, you're holding him like he might explode. He's sturdier than he looks." "He's 3 months old," Benedict protested. "He's made of paper and hope. I'm being appropriately careful." Lord Stanfield approached more cautiously, his relationship with his daughter still thawing slowly from years of rigid disapproval. But Eliza had noticed him softening over the months, particularly since Thomas's birth. Becoming a grandfather seemed to have cracked something in his careful composure. "He has your eyes, Eliza," her father said quietly, studying his grandson. "That same expressiveness. I hope you'll allow him to keep it rather than teaching him to hide as I tried to teach you." It was perhaps the closest her father had come to apologizing for 3 years of demanding she suppress her natural spirit. Eliza reached out and squeezed his hand, accepting the olive branch for what it was. They spent the afternoon together, conversation flowing easily between family members who'd learned to accept each other's imperfections. Lady Fanny told stories about Benedict's childhood that made him groan with embarrassment. Eliza's mother fussed over Thomas with the devoted attention of a grandmother finally allowed to express affection openly. Even Lord Stanfield relaxed slightly, offering opinions on estate management that Benedict actually seemed interested in hearing. Later that evening, after their guests had retired and Thomas had been settled in his crib by the nurse, Eliza and Benedict retreated to their private library. It had become their evening ritual, this quiet time together surrounded by books, talking or reading or simply existing comfortably in each other's presence. Benedict settled into his favorite chair while Eliza curled up on the sofa with a book she'd been attempting to read for 3 days. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes before Benedict spoke. "I've been thinking about that afternoon in the marketplace," he said, his voice quiet in the lamplight. "The day you danced and I watched like some sort of lurking observer. Do you ever wonder how different our lives would be if you'd dressed properly that day? If you'd stayed home and maintained your composure as your father wanted?" Eliza set down her book, considering the question. "I think about it sometimes. If I'd been properly dressed and properly composed, you might never have noticed me. You certainly wouldn't have approached me." "I'd noticed you before," Benedict admitted. "At the Pembridge ball 3 years ago. But you were performing propriety so perfectly that I convinced myself you were just another accomplished lady seeking a title. If you'd done the same in the marketplace, I would have walked past without realizing who you were." He stood and moved to sit beside her on the sofa, taking her hand in his. "You taught me something crucial that day, Eliza. You taught me that authenticity matters more than perfection. That being fully seen, even at your most improper, is more valuable than being admired while hidden. That love requires the courage to be yourself rather than what others expect you to be. You taught me the same things, Eliza said softly. I spent 3 years believing I was unlovable because I couldn't maintain the cold composure society demanded. You proved that someone could love me not despite my passion but because of it. That being too much for some people meant I was exactly enough for the right person. From the nursery down the hall, Thomas made a small crying sound, not distressed but announcing his presence. Both parents stood immediately, moving together toward their son with the practiced synchronization of people who'd learned to be partners in every aspect of life. Benedict reached the crib first and lifted Thomas carefully, making soothing sounds while rocking him gently. Eliza stood beside them, one hand on Benedict's arm, watching her husband comfort their son with a tenderness that still surprised her sometimes. "We made this," Benedict said wonderingly, looking at Thomas's tiny face. "This perfect small person. How did we manage that?" "Very carefully," Eliza replied with a smile. "Though I did most of the difficult work." "You did all of the difficult work," Benedict corrected. "I merely provided moral support and excessive worry." Thomas settled quickly, his crying replaced by small contented sounds. They stood together in the nursery, the three of them illuminated by lamplight and moonlight, a family built on authentic love rather than appropriate arrangement. "Do you regret it?" Benedict asked suddenly. The scandal, the gossip, society's continued skepticism about our match? You could have married someone more conventional, someone whose choice of you wouldn't have been questioned. "I regret nothing," Eliza said firmly. "I'd rather face society's judgment with you than face a lifetime of loneliness with someone appropriate. Besides, society's beginning to come around. We received 17 invitations for the upcoming season." "Which we're declining," Benedict reminded her. "We agreed to wait until Thomas is older before returning to London regularly." "Which will scandalize them all over again," Eliza said with satisfaction. "A duke choosing his family over social obligations. How shocking." They returned Thomas to his crib and stood watching him sleep for several moments, neither quite ready to leave. Finally, Benedict turned to Eliza and pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her in the way that still made her heart race after a year of marriage. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair, "for dancing wildly in that marketplace. For being brave enough to be yourself even when everyone told you not to be. For choosing me despite knowing life with a duke would mean constant scrutiny. For giving me Thomas and this life and happiness I didn't know I was allowed to want. Thank you for watching me dance and seeing something worth pursuing instead of something to condemn," Eliza replied. "For loving my passion instead of trying to control it. For building a life with me based on authenticity rather than performance." They stood together in the nursery doorway, watching their son sleep peacefully, and Eliza felt a wave of profound gratitude wash over her. Gratitude for the marketplace, for the simple dress, for the moment of defiant freedom that had changed everything. For Benedict's grey eyes watching her spin with wonder. For every choice that had led them here. The season of 1843 would be remembered for many things, but in the years to come, it would be remembered most for the day a spirited young woman danced wildly in a common marketplace and caught the attention of a duke who'd been drowning in propriety. For the scandal of a duke choosing passion over perfection, authenticity over appropriate arrangement. For proof that the truest nobility lies not in titles or wealth but in the courage to be fully oneself and the wisdom to choose love over comfortable convention. Somewhere in London, society continued to gossip and speculate about the Duke and Duchess of Fenwick. But in Yorkshire, in a nursery filled with lamplight and love, none of that mattered. They'd built something far more valuable than social approval. They'd built a family, a partnership, a life based on being fully known and loved anyway. And it had all started with one wild dance in a marketplace, one moment of choosing freedom over fear, one duke brave enough to see authenticity and call it beautiful. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment below sharing which moment resonated most with you. Have you ever discovered your worth through someone who truly saw you? Subscribe for more stories that remind us love transforms by illuminating and not changing who we are. We are building a community of romance enthusiasts for more tales of courage and authenticity. If you're up for it, another video will appear on your screen at the end. Click it for another beautiful love story. Thank you for listening, and may you always find the courage to dance wildly when your heart calls for it.